Today, the Kremlin is in an absolute state of panic, and the reason is floating in the middle of the ocean. We see that there is now a massive traffic jam that is choking the Russian war machine. Throughout 2025, we saw that logistics collapsed, and hence why Russian crude on the water spiked to 88 million barrels. That's not just a delay, this is a systemic failure, and that has trapped Moscow in a financial stranglehold. The shadow fleet, Putin's secret economic lifeline, is collapsing. Moscow built this navy of rusting tankers to save its economy, but today it is choking on its own cargo. This financial hemorrhage explains the desperation on the battlefield. That is why today Russia has amassed nearly 150,000 troops for a suicidal assault on Pokrovsk. They are racing against bankruptcy that has been building for months. And today you will see why the Ghost Armada is sinking. And you'll see why Vladimir Putin is very afraid of what comes next. My name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kiev Post and a national security advisor. The Russian situation gets worse by the day. And that's why they have to make such a big deal of things like Pokrovsk, a town that nobody knew where it was before this war, but today is all that Moscow can talk about. Taking Pokrovsk is not the same as taking Kiev. Remember, that was Russia's objective. More than 3.75 years ago, Russia thought it would take Kiev within 3 days in its special military operation. But now, 1,360 days in this war, it's no closer to reaching that objective. Instead, it can brag that soon, it hopes, it will take Pokrovsk. But what's behind that? Why is Russia so desperate? Well, let's dive into that and take a look. But first, thank you everybody, all of you, who have become subscribers of the channel. We have now surpassed 250,000 subscribers. As you know, this channel exists only for one reason alone, and that is to support Ukraine. I'm here in Kiev, and we must get to the world the truth of what is happening here, but also the truth about Russia. It is not a country that will win. It is a country that is losing, and a country that will lose. And sure enough, yes, my master's and PhD dissertations are about the Putin regime, so I've spent a lot of time reading about it. And today what we're seeing is nothing less than the end of that regime. So if you haven't already, please do subscribe, like this video, and consider becoming a channel member today. But one other thing, we also passed our goal of 50,000 euros for the Ukrainian soldiers to get life-saving drones. I greatly appreciate everybody who's contributed to that. As you know, all donations were matched by a very generous donor, and so we have actually given more than 100,000 euros in just 12 days that will help save Ukrainian soldiers' lives, so that somebody's father, somebody's son, somebody's husband will come home. Thank you. In the first comment, if you haven't already, you can see how you too can donate. So let's dive into this. Let's take a look at what's going on. So first, to understand the Kremlin's fear, we have to look at their failed gamble on the ocean. Consider this. This shadow fleet was supposed to be Russia's answer to Western sanctions, but today it has become a trap. After price caps were introduced, Moscow chose to build a parallel logistics network to bypass Western rules. They amassed a fleet of aging, risky vessels to keep exports flowing without Western insurance. Now, most of these ships, if you've not seen them, are over 15 years old. They're registered to shell companies in Dubai and Hong Kong. That is, that they fly flags of convenience from small states with zero inspection capacity. But the gamble? It has failed because the fleet cannot handle the volume. Russia is now forced to violate OPEC Plus quotas just to push this volume. But the oil has nowhere to go. Instead of a secret weapon, analysts now describe this fleet as a floating boneyard. And this boneyard is the only thing that today keeps the Russian economy alive. The West has stopped watching these ships and started hunting them. Then the era of warnings is over. The era of enforcement seems to be beginning. There are many legitimate reasons to stop these ships. Chuck Farr, my colleague, and I have often discussed this. As you know, Chuck Farr is a former Navy SEAL squadron leader. But we have the capacity to stop these ships. If the U.S. Navy wished to, we could stop every one of them. There is legitimate grounds for these interdictions. Consider this. Under the right of visit, naval forces can board vessels suspected of being stateless or of flying fraudulent flags. Shadow tankers often turn off the responders to hide, giving NATO navies legal cause to seize them. However, other countries are not buying Russia's oil, and that's where Russia has a problem. Now consider this. The S&P Global notes that 80% of Russian crude moves on these ghost ships. That makes them a perfect target for what we should be going after. Brussels has blacklisted 558 specific vessels and targeted them to make sure that they cannot refuel anywhere near a NATO port. But every new sanction, it raises the risk that a ship will be stranded, unable to refuel or insure its cargo. Today, we need a policy shift. It needs to be more than simply that the West has more sanctions, but rather that the West enforces its sanctions. Consider this. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has signaled that Washington is done with new sanctions. But now it's time for total enforcement. The U.S. is moving to close the loopholes that allow the shadow fleet to keep floating. This shift will create a compliance nightmare for everyone, including the banks and the insurers. But the result is that the cost for Russia will become exorbitant. Before, to transport oil to Asia cost about $1.5 million per voyage. Today, it's close to $7 million. Moscow is paying a fortune to ship oil that no one wants to touch. The economic squeeze is forcing Russia's allies to betray them, and that's why today we see this increasing friction, because Moscow is bleeding money on every single barrel. China is ruthlessly exploiting this weakness, demanding such massive discounts that Russian profit margins are evaporating. India is increasing its refusal to accept Russian crude. Today, that means that Russia has fewer buyers. As we've discussed many times before, about 80 to 85% of Russia's oil is bought by India and China. If they don't buy this oil, who's going to buy it? What other clients are there? Now, consider this as well. The U.S. has a vested interest in selling more oil. It has a lot. And in order to sell more oil, it can use these sanctions as leverage to boost U.S. export. And that's something that this current administration seems very keen to do. It's not because it's against Russia, but because simply it helps American businesses. So consider this. Because of this backlog, Russia today has oil it cannot sell. Russia no longer has floating cash. Today it has a liability. It's paying money to store oil that it cannot sell. This financial crisis creates a ticking clock for the war in Ukraine. The Shadow Fleet pays for the artillery, it pays for the rockets, it pays for the soldiers' salaries. But as costs rise and the backlog grows, the cash flow required to sustain the war is simply drying up. Payments to troops are delayed, and we've seen that the industrial base within Russia is suffering from a lack of liquidity. This well enough explains the frantic, suicidal push on the ground. The Kremlin needs a battlefield victory. Today it's looking everywhere for one. And that's why today it looks at Pokrovsk. They're burning through the reserves because they know they cannot afford a long war of attrition anymore. If it's not clear, Russia today is desperate. What we see on the battlefield is nothing less than desperation. In fact, just yesterday, I spoke with our old friend, General Ben Hodges, for more than an hour. And the way that he described the situation on the ground was incredible, incredibly insightful as well. As always, he didn't mince words in describing Russia's situation as being bad, but getting even worse. But that's why today the desperation is manifesting in the meat grinders of Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk has become the very center of gravity for Russia. Russia has no time left for tactics. Russia has concentrated its 150,000 troops there, throwing them into a full frontal assault because it has no other options. Pokrovsk had been a vital logistics hub. Today, it's not. Everything there has been destroyed. But that's the part that makes it incredible. So why is Russia pushing so hard? Why does Russia think this is their only solution? Well, the answer is simple. Because Russia will never take Kiev. And so Russia today must show some sort of benefit, that it's done something. It's wasted over 1,100,000 of its own soldiers' lives. And what can it show for it? Today, Russia controls less of Ukraine than it did in the beginning of 2022. Today, Russia controls less of Russia than it did in 2022. Today, Russia is being challenged. Russia has been shown to be a paper tiger. For years, the West feared what would come from Russia. But today we see, even against Ukraine, a population that's realistically about 25 million people. And for Ukraine, versus the 140 million people of Russia, Russia's wars of attrition no longer have effect. In fact, we've seen that with drones, they're totally ineffective. Drones have changed this war entirely because today it prevents the Russians from getting close to the Ukrainian lines. So Ukraine today, yes, it does cede territory. It does realize places like Pokrovsk, in the end, will have to be ceded to the Russians. But that is short term. The strategy here, the logic for this, affirmed by General Hodges yesterday, is simply to bleed out the Russians. Allow them to take Pokrovsk. Allow them to take this rubble. But if you look at the map, between Pokrovsk and the next major city, it's a lot of empty fields. For Russia to reach those next cities, it becomes very hard. Those are not defensible terrains. And that's why today, Ukraine is hitting the processing side of the oil equation. It's hitting deep inside of Russia. We've seen the drone strikes on the refineries in Volgograd. We see the petrochemical factories, like in Stavropol, that are burning. That is money that Russia cannot afford to lose. And that's why today we see that every refinery fire is forcing Russia into a harder position, a position where its internal revenues are being crippled. Today, the strikes on drone bases in occupied Donetsk show Ukraine is degrading Russia's ability to retaliate. And this double pressure, interdiction on the seas as well as destruction on the land, is breaking the Putin system. The cracks inside of Russia today are becoming impossible to hide. The Kremlin is very clearly nervous. In fact, Dmitry Peskov, in his recent statements, said that negotiation is inevitable. This is not a sign of strength. This is a sign that Russia wants to take a break. Now, Peskov himself, as you know, is the Kremlin spokesman, and typically he says what you would expect, that the Kremlin is going to seize Kiev, that their battle plans have not changed. They will win. But today, even he is signaling that things are not going well. And it's partially because their economy is imploding. The West is countering this and doing what it can to tighten the noose around Russia to make sure that the frozen Russian assets can be used to fund Ukraine. Now, contrast this, though, with Kiev. Kiev is cleaning up house. We've seen a number of recent corruption scandals in Ukraine. Those scandals, they're a positive sign. What we see is that Ukraine is doing its best to fight corruption, to make sure that it can win. That is what normal countries do. That's what European countries do. That is a good thing. Russia, on the other hand, tries to hide its corruption, tries to deny how very bad the situation is. But that's where they have a problem. So you have to accept that you have a problem to solve the problem. But if you don't acknowledge that you have a problem, how can things get better? If you don't acknowledge that your own family members, like in the case of Putin, are running a number of senior jobs in the government, how can you say that cronyism is a problem that you'll fight? Obviously, they cannot. But there's also a difference. Ukrainians today are fighting for freedom. They're fighting for justice. The Russians, they're fighting for profit. Either the Russian soldiers or the Russian government are motivated by making money. But look at the recent story in Ukraine of a hero. Look at Alexander Gordenko, the farmer Rambo of Kherson. He was a civilian but refused to surrender. As a result, the Russian invaders took his land. But after the liberation, he cleared mines himself and bought electronic warfare gear to fight back. He shot down dozens of Russian drones, disrupting their attacks so effectively that the Russians specifically targeted him. Now, a Russian drone did finally kill him on September 5th. But think about this. The money to build the drone came from a tanker. It was a tanker that was evading sanctions. When the West stops a Shadow Fleet vessel, it's not just economic policy. It is cutting the budget of terror. The terror that kills heroes like Gordenko. Today, we see that Russia is fighting two different wars. It is fighting two fatal sieges. One siege is in the trenches of Donbass, where its army is bleeding out for every meter of ground. The other siege is on the high seas, where its economy is suffocating under the weight of unsold oil. The panic in the Kremlin is real because they know the math no longer adds up. The question is not how much land they can take. The real question is how long the regime can survive when its army is bleeding on the ground while its economy is drowning in the seas. Thank you for watching. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, consider becoming a channel member today, and leave your comments below and share the video with others. And please do see the first comment how you too can donate for the Ukrainian soldiers to get life-saving drones. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.